Hello and welcome to another episode of Parts Are Repaired. Today we're going to be working on a PS5 Blu-ray edition. As you can see, it has no side panels on either side. It has been opened. The warranty sticker is hanging off. So this one says that it has no power. I'm going to go ahead and turn it on and see if it has no power. And if it does, we'll go ahead and get it taken apart and see if we can figure out what's going on with it. Okay, so the eject button does nothing, power button does nothing. So this one actually does have no power, so let's go ahead and get it taken apart and see if we can figure it out. All right, so here we have it taken apart enough to test to see if we have 12 volts on the power supply. So I'm gonna go ahead and check it right here on the back side of the connector that plugs into the power supply. And as you can see, we do not have 12 volts here. So we're probably going to have to take the power supply out and see whether or not it's the board bringing it down to zero or if the power supply itself has zero. Okay, so we got the board taken off. I'm going to go ahead and use my multimeter to test at the actual connector for the power supply and see if there's 12 volts there. And let's see what we got. And it looks like we have nothing there as well. So it looks like the power supply itself is bad. I'm not sure if that's the only thing that's wrong with this console, but that's a good place to start. So we're going to go ahead and pull the power supply out and replace that with a donor. Okay, so I got the power supply out. I just wanted to double check and make sure that it has no voltage, and it still does not have voltage. So I'm going to pull the one out of the donor and we'll check it and make sure it works. Okay, so this is the one from the donor board. I'm going to go ahead and check it just to make sure it works before we put it back in. And there we go. We have 12 volts on this one. So I'm going to go ahead and get that put back in. We got it back together enough to test. So let's go ahead and see what we got. All right. So plugged in. So with the other power supply in, it no longer has no power. It beeps when I push the button, but it still doesn't do anything else. So I'm going to have to go ahead, take it back apart and see if I can figure out what exactly is keeping it from booting now. Okay, so here we are. We have it taken back apart. Let's go ahead and check for 12 volt here. Okay, we do have 12 volts there. So that's good. We didn't have that before. Go ahead and put this here. Okay, we have 12 volts there. Okay, so here we are over at the workstation, and as you can see, I have the power supply set up to basically give the board 12 volts and see exactly what the boot sequence looks like. Okay, so it's not quite normal. It should go up to about 310 to 320 and then fall back down to around 7 milliamps. And I noticed that it hung there quite a while at 294 milliamps. So what we're going to have to do is figure out what's going on with the board, and I'm going to be doing some testing under the microscope. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to that. Okay, so I forgot to start my recording. I located a couple spots where I didn't have the voltage I should have had. I didn't have a 1.8 volt and a 3.3 volt near the HDMI IC, so I went ahead and took that off and replaced it with one from a donor board. And here I am just putting it back on. I also removed a couple other ICs around the HDMI chip, which I believe are voltage regulators. This one here, these two little ones here, I replaced those off of a donor board, and The other one I was going to just put back on, this one here. I was going to just put this back on, but I did notice that the side of it is a little burnt, so I went ahead and took that back off and replaced that after the fact. Then on the back side of the board, again, this is the top left pin there is the one that was supposed to have 3.3 and the bottom right was supposed to have 1.8 and didn't. So I'm just getting those put back on. And then I'll do a little bit of testing. And doing the testing, I found out that it does not have the voltage still. So after some discussion with some people online, I decided to go ahead and pull the Wi-Fi IC off. So here's the Wi-Fi IC off of a donor board. I've already removed the one from the board that we're working on, and I'm just coming in with my soldering iron, and I floated some leaded solder on there, and then I'm coming in with the soldering iron and the desolder braid to take all of the old solder off so that I can reball the chip. This takes just a little bit, and I don't actually have the right size solder balls for this chip because it takes a 0.76 millimeter solder ball, and all I had at the time, the biggest I had was 0.5. So I decided to go ahead and use two 4 millimeter solder balls for this, which is okay. I mean, they will mold together and become one. So it's not that big of a deal. Excuse my dirty fingernails because I am a mechanic by profession. So sometimes my nails are a little dirty. But yeah, like I said, I ended up using 4 millimeter solder balls, and I did 2 on each pad so that they would basically be an 8 millimeter solder ball. And this part's going to take a little bit of time, so I'm going to go ahead and speed through this part so that it doesn't just drag on, because it did take a significant amount of time due to the fact that, again, I do have to put 2 solder balls on each individual pad. So now that I got all the solder balls on there, I'm just going to come in with my hot air station, and I have it set to 450 degrees Celsius at 1% airflow, just for this initial part to get them stuck to the actual Wi-Fi IC. And then once the solder balls melt, I will come back in with a little bit of flux on there and then reflow them again at about 40% airflow at 450 degrees Celsius, just to make sure that they're good and in place and float on properly onto the IC. That way when we go to set it down onto the board and flow it into place, it doesn't have any issues with the balls being a little crooked or not quite molded together good enough. So here I am coming in with the hot air station again, and like I said, this is about 30 to 40% airflow, and I'm just going over until I see all the balls melt and become uniform. Once they become uniform, then I will let it cool down so that I can get it put onto the board. So here I turned on my ring light so that I could see the glare on the balls a little bit better. That way I could see if they're more uniform. And I'm just going over them again just to make sure that they all melted into place. I'm going to get this cleaned up real quick, and then we will work on getting the board. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and flow leaded solder onto the board so that I can clean up all the pads and make sure that there's no excess solder, so that we get a nice good joint between the Wi-Fi IC and the actual motherboard. The good thing about this is the Wi-Fi IC doesn't have too many spots or too many balls, so it wasn't that bad. It would have really been a hard task if I would have had to put 2 balls on every single one of, like, let's say the SSD controller or something like that, because that would have taken an extreme amount of time. So I'm just cleaning up here, and then I'm going to add a little bit of flux after I get it all cleaned up. And we don't need a lot because you don't want it to flow off. So I'm just spreading it around with my finger. And then I felt right there, I can feel the solder sticking up right there. So I'm going to just come in with my desoldering braid, and I'll see if I can just wick it off. And if not, what I like to do is just put some flux right on the back side of the wick, and then touch the soldering iron to the flux, and that will pull it right off of there. And I'm just going to go over a few little spots here that I see that are a little rough still. And then once we get those spots cleaned up, I will apply some more flux to it. Just a nice smooth layer, nothing too insane. You don't want it to boil and move your chip out of the way. Luckily with this, the Wi-Fi IC is a really big chip. I mean, it has multiple ICs on it, as well as capacitors and everything underneath that metal shield. And that metal shield is just soldered on there, so be real careful when you're reflowing that or reballing that you don't knock that metal shield off, because if you knock it off, one, it's kind of a little bit of a pain to get back on, but also you have to worry about all the capacitors and stuff that are real close to the edge of that metal shield underneath the metal shield. And what you could do is you could end up knocking those into other things or off their pads, and you wouldn't know it because it's underneath that metal shield. So if that metal shield does shift at all, I would recommend heating it up, taking it completely off. This metal shield right here, taking it completely off, checking everything, and then obviously fixing anything that you need to fix, and then put the shield back on. Okay, so now I'm just trying to get the chip into place so that I could reflow it down to the board. So I'm just adjusting it here. Let me move my camera up so we can see the whole entire chip, because like I said, this is a really big chip, so it's going to be a little bit harder to see the movement. If when it does move, it probably won't move at all. It'll just stay in place, and then we'll just have to nudge it to see if it is melted, the solder balls are melted, and that it is attached to the pads. So I'm going to come in with my hot air station at 480 degrees Celsius with 5% airflow right here, just to heat this up, because again, this is a really big IC. It's basically ICs on top of ICs. So I'm just going around it just to get it initially secured to the board, and then I'll come in and check to make sure that it's secured to the board, so that I can add some more flux and actually reflow it into place. So again, just nice big circles around it. You want to heat up the board and the whole chip at the same time so that you don't get any uneven solder joints underneath, because the last thing you want is some balls melting before other balls melt, and that's going to create a problem for you later on. Okay, so I'm just going to continue going around until I think that the solder balls have melted and secured to the board. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come in with my tweezers, and I'm going to nudge it just to see if it actually attached itself to the board. And then if it is attached to the board, which it is, I'm going to go ahead with my flux, and I'm going to add flux all the way around the chip. Oh, no. That's okay. We should be all right. It doesn't look like the solder balls melted properly. I don't know how. They must have just barely melted and were held on there. So I'm just going to go ahead and roll with it, because this is such a big chip. I think it'll be okay. It, kind of held in position by the dimples.
So I'm just going to go ahead and go around this until I think it's nice and hot, and then nudge it to see if it's actually secured to the board. So you don't want to rush this part. You want to make sure that the solder underneath the chip is melted. So what I'm watching for is the flux to start bubbling. That'll give me my first impression that it's getting really hot underneath. And then once I feel like it's hot enough that I can nudge it, I'll come in with my tweezers and just lightly nudge it from the side. And what we're looking for when I do nudge it is for it to move and then bounce back. If you don't get that bounce back and it just moves over, then the solder balls were not melted enough. So the most important thing to look for is that bounce back when you go to nudge it. So again, I'm just going to keep heating it up. Make sure it's nice and hot and that all those solder balls are melted. And then I'm going to come in with my tweezers from the side. I'm going to give it a little bit of a nudge and see it's still not quite melted enough. So I'm just going to keep focusing my heat right on the chip, and now see how I nudge it and it bounces back. So we're good, and that's set in place real nicely. I'm going to go ahead and get this all cleaned up, and then we will get this board put back in there and test it out finally. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with my alcohol, my isopropyl alcohol, and this is 99% isopropyl alcohol. I'm going to clean up all the flux around it, and then I'm going to, because of how much flux is under the chip, as you can see, I'm spraying under the edge of it to rinse the flux out from underneath the chip. And then I will come in with the canned air and blow all that flux and alcohol out from underneath the chip so we can get it back together. Okay, so here we are back together enough to test. As you know, this PS5 has been a very long road. We replaced the power supply because we didn't have 12 volts, and that fixed that portion of it. But then when we were getting a beep with no lights, no nothing, so I hooked it up to my bench power supply to see what the boot sequence looked like. It would go up to about 295 milliamps, hold for about 5 seconds, and then drop back down to about 7 milliamps. So it was pretty close to normal, but not quite. I did doing some checks around the board, checking every capacitor on the board for shorts. Didn't find anything, but in the process of checking standby voltages, I did realize that I was missing a 1.8 voltage and a 3.3 next to the HDMI IC. So I went ahead and replaced the chips that those voltages come from, and that did absolutely nothing to fix the problem. It still had it, so I thought maybe it was the actual HDMI IC, so I replaced that. Again, that did absolutely nothing. I was thinking about replacing the dialogue chip for the Southbridge or the SSD controller, but I decided not to. I went ahead and ordered a USB to TTL adapter. That way I could use UART and see what I was getting, and that didn't really give me a whole lot of help. It just gave me a general something failure. So that was of no real help. So then I just pretty much had to think about it in a process of, if it's a bad SSD controller, then it's going to go to about 100 milliamps. If it's a short on the Wi-Fi IC, it usually goes to about 315. Well, it was getting pretty close to that. So I decided to go ahead and remove the Wi-Fi IC, reball that, and put that on. And that's where we're at right now. So I'm pretty anxious about this one because I have spent a lot of time on it, and I'm hoping that my guess of the Wi-Fi IC is correct, but we won't know until we try. So here we go. All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1. All right, so we got a blue light. That's good. Still blue. Kind of looks white on the camera, but it is blue. Still blue. Come on. Oh my God, yeah. Oh my God, we got a white light. All right, let's see if the eject button works. So the eject button does work. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off and get it all the way back together so that we can hook it up to an HDMI port and test it.
So here we are, we got it back together. As you can see, my side panels came in. I went with the black ones. They were only about 18 bucks off Allied Express, and they actually snap on pretty well and look pretty good. So I'm kind of glad I ordered these ones. But let's go ahead and check this and see if it's going to boot up. So we do have a blue light. That's good. Now, do we have anything on the screen? Nothing yet. Oh, there we go. PS5 logo on the screen. So this one is working. I'm just going to go ahead and get into the boot menu and check. Let me plug my controller in so we can actually do something with it. Okay, I got my controller plugged in there. All right, got somebody else's profile on there. I'll have to go ahead and remove that. I will reformat it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do the update, put my profile on it, make sure it updates, make sure it connects to the internet, considering that we you replace the Wi-Fi AC, so I want to make sure that that still works. I believe the controller still connects. Controller works, so Bluetooth is working, so that's good. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and get this set up, and then I will jump back in once I get it done. Okay, so here we are at the dashboard. I went ahead and connected to the Wi-Fi, and the Wi-Fi did work, so the Wi-Fi AC is working. I also updated the console and downloaded my profile, so it is not banned. Thankfully, I don't have to deal with that again. If you guys like this video, you should join me next week. I'm going to be doing a repair on a Nintendo Switch that has no power. This will be the first Nintendo Switch in my Parts Are Repaired series, and I'd like to hear from you guys in the comments. So comment down below, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.